We are now moving forward to disrupt the market. We were able to take something that I quite literally, am not exaggerating, typically takes 3 years, and they got it done in 8 weeks.
Inconclusive test results coming out of the state's brand new lab.
So does that mean people were getting negative results who were actually positive, and there was no way to notify them that they had the wrong result?
Yeah,
Absolutely.
it's tragic.
That lab should be shut down because they're jeopardizing people's life.
They deviated from what was submitted to the FDA. We cannot do experiment while we are testing patient samples.
The public deserves to know what's going on in their state lab, and everybody deserves to have correct results.
They feel like we're being lied to.
Any other laboratory would have been shut down.
This was not just a, oops, we made a minor mistake that didn't harm any patients.
A Southern California school district has stopped COVID testing after they say students got false positive results from the state's troubled COVID testing lab.
This COVID just keeps taking stuff away from us, you know?
If there was a contamination, then everybody should know that there was a contamination.
It's the cover-up that's the problem, right?
We're learning more about what they found thanks to the high-profile Elizabeth Holmes Theranos trial.
People couldn't work.
And the hardest part is really there's no recourse.
There is no penalty for this.
Every patient sample goes with somebody's plate.
I think the whistleblowers get a great service to the people of California.
As much as people complain about the media has a purpose to be a watchdog on the government when they won't be a watchdog on themselves.
There's an old saw that says, if you continue to do what you've done, you'll get what you've got.
Now for a CBS Sacramento special report. Here's investigative reporter Julie Watts.
As the Omicron variant spreads, even among the vaccinated, and there's a renewed focus on accurate and timely testing, we're taking a look back at the lessons learned from our year-long investigation into the state's troubled COVID testing lab, which gave a voice to brave whistleblowers who risked their careers in the interest of public health and shined a spotlight on shocking public health failures that it appears regulators tried to hide. Over the past year, we've conducted dozens of interviews with whistleblowers and lab experts, submitted hundreds of public records requests, and reviewed thousands of pages of internal lab documents. Still, public health officials try to discredit the reporting and the whistleblower complaints, even after their own inspectors confirmed the findings, concluding the lab posed immediate jeopardy to patient health and safety, likely to cause serious injury, harm, or death. But the state didn't warn the public or even pause testing as problems continued. This reporting was cited by local, national, and international news organizations and prompted state and federal investigations. And it began with a billion-dollar promise. Yay! California's new PerkinElmer Public Health Lab was supposed to revolutionize COVID testing in the face of a newly emergent and poorly understood virus.
We are now moving forward to disrupt the market.
The governor promised a first-of-its-kind public-private partnership that would all but guarantee faster, cheaper, potentially life-saving COVID results by competing with commercial labs at a time when COVID tests were hard to come by.
This is exactly what the federal government should be doing.
The project was led by California Health Secretary Dr. Mark Ghaly, who oversees the California Department of Public Health.
This was a big investment.
The price tag, $125 million to get the Valencia facility up and running, plus ongoing utility, maintenance, and other building expenses. That was in addition to a $1.7 billion no-bid contract for longtime lobbyist PerkinElmer to staff and run the lab using their brand new FDA emergency use authorized COVID test.
We were able to take something that I quite literally, am not exaggerating, typically takes 3 years to get done, and they got it done again in 8 weeks under budget.
From the beginning, many questioned the quality of a rushed lab, but the governor made big promises.
We are demanding test results back within 24 hours, the latest 48 hours, and we have provisions in the contract to guarantee that turnaround time.
His team stressed the importance of quick test results for contact tracing and public health. So when the lab went live in November 2020, heading into the peak of the pandemic in California, CBS 13 decided to put the promised testing turnaround times to the test. With California on extended lockdown and reporters still working from home, we used my family of 4 as test subjects. But instead of 24 or even 48-hour test results, 2 of our 4 initial tests came back inconclusive. Then my son's retest came back inconclusive, twice. Turned out, we weren't alone.
Inconclusive test results coming out of the state's brand new lab.
The state didn't respond to initial public records requests, but county data revealed the rate of inconclusive results from the state lab was as much as 61 times higher than other California COVID labs combined.
Dr. Gelly, CBS 13 uncovered a surprisingly high number of inconclusive test results.
When we asked the health secretary about it during a virtual press conference, he dismissed concerns, blaming problems with a chemical reaction.
We've identified some of the issues and have since corrected it. We feel like we're on the
We would later learn, shortly after Galley made those claims, state inspectors found deficiencies at the lab so severe they posed immediate jeopardy to patient health and safety, likely to cause serious injury, harm, or death.
Health officials warning of a Christmas COVID crisis.
Yet health officials didn't warn the public about potentially compromised COVID results as deaths peaked and hundreds of thousands relied on the lab's results to decide whether to travel or work or visit compromised loved ones who'd been isolated for months. We now know too many got wrong results. And when the lab later corrected them, inspectors found it failed to tell people they'd actually been positive. They were simply advised to retest, often days or weeks later. We may never know how many people unknowingly exposed others to COVID. The lab said it didn't track people with wrong negative results, but cited a 5% probability to inspectors.
No one's naive when you put an operation from scratch like this together, that there won't be challenges.
Whistleblowers watching our reports believed those challenges were costing lives. They reached out to us as a last resort.
Still ahead, contaminations, false positives, and delayed COVID results keep healthy kids out of school.
While many believe false negative results during the peak of the pandemic likely had serious consequences on public health, as case rates dropped and students returned to school, we witnessed the consequences of false positives, lab contamination, and delayed test results.
Every game is just a blessing.
After a year without Friday night lights or in-person classes, every week of their shortened 6-game pandemic season, high school athletes anxiously awaited their ticket to play. Negative COVID test results.
There's a lot of anxiety over if we're going to be able to get test results back in time.
Nevada Union Athletic Director Daniel Crossan was one of many forced to make the heartbreaking calls to cancel coveted games because the teams didn't get their required COVID results in time from the state's troubled COVID testing lab.
And ultimately, they failed our school and they failed our kids.
Tina Watts' son struggled with canceled games at Rockland High.
It was just really heartbreaking, just crushing.
Despite a contract that required results in under 48 hours, some were delayed by as much as a week, which for many kids was yet another blow to their mental health.
In the wake of all of this, our kids are suffering.
By April, Todd was one of many parents who wanted answers about why regulators hadn't released their overdue investigation into the state COVID lab. You see, in February, following our early reports, the state acknowledged inspectors did find significant deficiencies at the lab, but wouldn't reveal what the deficiencies were. They promised a public report by mid-March, but March came and went.
If they haven't fixed their problems, how are we supposed to trust them?
What's taking so long?
You know, we are due an explanation.
The state owes it to the people of California and to these kids.
Then things got worse.
We were all so excited. It was going to be our first week back full-time at school with everybody there.
Instead, just 2 days after returning to campus, Reese and Riley were sent home to quarantine. They were among thousands of kids across the state quarantined per state regulation because they had a so-called close contact with a student who got a positive result from the state lab.
This COVID just keeps taking stuff away from us, you know?
Like most of the quarantine kids, Reese and Riley didn't have symptoms, but their brother, who had to test for school wrestling, got a borderline positive result, forcing the girls to quarantine too, even after they tested negative for COVID.
It's really like affecting my mental health, finally being able to go back in person and then being stuck in front of a computer and not being able to do any of my sports. And then it's just quite depressing, you know, being ripped away from you.
It breaks my heart.
Their mom, Pam, was one of many who questioned positive results from the state lab.
Are those positive?
According to whistleblowers, many likely weren't. They allege the lab was releasing results despite known contamination, and provided internal emails between top lab management discussing the, quote, contamination issue.
If there was a contamination, then everybody should know that there was a contamination.
It's the cover-up that's the problem, right?
The state refused to comment on the contamination concerns, noting its test was the most sensitive on the market. But the lab's positivity rate was consistently higher than California's positivity rate overall. Then came the ripple effect.
Students got false positive results from the state's troubled COVID testing lab.
The Culver City School District was first to suspend testing following an unprecedented number of, quote, false positives from the state lab confirmed by County Public Health. And in El Dorado Union, where Reese and Riley go to school,
our positivity rate has increased over 1,000% with the state lab.
District Superintendent Ron Carruth explained as soon as they switched from the commercial lab they had been using, their positive tests spiked.
We have questions about the accuracy and validity of the test.
Then the ripple effect widened. As negative tests became increasingly required for travel and work,
people couldn't work.
Tim, who asked we not use his last name, said he was blindsided by a positive result ahead of a business trip.
That affected so many people that I have everyday contact with, their livelihood.
He says his coworkers and wife also had to quarantine because of his positive result from the state lab, even though he had negative results from 2 other labs, including one the next day.
Once you get that label that you're positive, there's absolutely nothing you can do to change it.
And the hardest part is really that there's no recourse.
There's no penalty for this.
Following our reports, the state allowed at least one school district to end its quarantine early. By the end of the year, more than 1,600 schools and districts were contracted with the state lab.
Should schools be using the state COVID lab?
Yes, they should, Dr. Galley.
When the health secretary wouldn't answer our questions, we asked the governor about ongoing lab problems during his May budget press tour. Twice. And twice he implied the problems were exaggerated.
Those all were resolved. We had the CEO, Perkin-Elmer, personally get involved in tweaking and fixing those things. Some of them were wildly overstated, and everyone has a right, that transparency.
We now know, just 1 week before that interview, federal inspectors had issued yet another notice of deficiencies for lab practices that posed immediate jeopardy to patient health and safety, likely to cause serious injury, harm, or death.
I have all the confidence that those issues have been resolved, and some of them were a bit, with respect to overstated. Some were accurate, and we worked to correct them very, very quickly, many months ago. And
3 days after that press conference, the governor's own state inspectors sent Perkin-Elmer this notice with the governor's seal, clarifying the lab was still not in compliance and the evidence of correction was not acceptable. Records now reveal the lab would fail to correct those deficiencies for 6 more months, processing millions of COVID tests in the meantime.
I feel like we're being lied to.
The bottom line is this all could have been avoided.
Still ahead, concerning whistleblower allegations from inside California's COVID lab.
If it weren't for brave whistleblowers risking their careers in the name of public health, we may never have learned of the shocking public health failures at California's COVID testing lab. Quality control failures, contamination, swapped samples, wrong results. Those were just a few of the concerns raised by whistleblowers and later confirmed by inspectors.
That lab should be shut down because they're jeopardizing people's life.
Long before the investigations and school quarantines, whistleblowers saw the health secretary's response to our initial reports
and have since corrected it
and reached out to reveal what was really happening inside California's COVID testing lab.
There's more shocking things that are going on.
It began with one whistleblower and quickly evolved into many with concerning allegations.
When's the last time you saw someone sleeping?
Last week.
From unlicensed lab techs watching videos and literally sleeping while processing nasal swabs for testing, to sample swabs found in lab restrooms more than once.
Samples would go missing or they would be switched. The staff were very untrained and unsupervised.
The initial concerns focused on untrained staff.
If they realized that there was a mistake made, nobody knew what to do.
They're unlicensed, they're fresh from college, and the people training them are also unlicensed.
Whistleblowers provided evidence many unlicensed techs processing samples either hadn't been fully trained or evaluated for competency.
I was one of those people.
Instead of pledging to correct the issues, the state denied the allegations. But shortly before our report was set to air following the Super Bowl on CBS, we received dozens of new quality control reports describing incidents of contamination, swap samples, and repeated testing errors, along with new training and competency records that supported the whistleblower allegations. Again, the state insisted no employee without sign-off competency is running samples. But within hours of the denial, whistleblowers warned us managers were being called in during the Super Bowl to alter those competency records ahead of our report, quote, since this became even more urgent. We immediately warned regulators. Did the state send someone there to make sure that didn't happen?
Julie, I'm not going to speculate on things.
Kate Fulmar was then spokesperson for Health Secretary Galley. Are you concerned documents might have been altered yesterday?
Julie, I'm not going to speculate on documents that you say you have that I haven't seen.
As a state regulator and PerkinElmer's lab partner, CDPH should have already seen the documents we'd seen. Their logo is on all of them. But they initially called the allegations outrageous and unsubstantiated, accusing us of irresponsible journalism. Then, just before the story aired that night, they changed their response.
Saying, quote, "We are troubled by these allegations and will investigate them immediately and thoroughly."
What changed in the 4 hours between the CDPH email and your response? Did you confirm the allegations?
I think we're going to leave it there, Julie.
We now know the state did send inspectors that night who confirmed the whistleblower allegations. Contrary to the state's denials, they found roughly half the lab staff did not have documented competency or training. And that was minor compared to the other allegations they confirmed, which they wouldn't reveal for 9 more months, when they would again appear to discredit whistleblowers, claiming inspectors were not able to substantiate reporting of destruction of documents and data. Except we didn't report that. Here's what we said.
2 hours after we asked the state about what we'd found, we received evidence some staff were told to come in Super Bowl Sunday to alter records,
which whistleblowers said they couldn't complete once inspectors showed up that night.
But before then, they did not care. They did not care about the employees raising these concerns. They did not care about the lack of quality.
For the whistleblowers, this was a David versus Goliath story. Them versus the California Department of Public Health, which controls their licenses and is the regulator of its own lab.
It's a conflict of interest.
Most of them said they only came to us after their complaints were ignored.
Yeah, I complained to management and I got 0 emails back.
Nobody listens to anybody in the laboratory.
And personnel issues were the least of their concerns. For instance, in this email from January, an employee was reprimanded by management for sharing a concern in a group email. The concern? That she and her team don't feel comfortable releasing results with quality control failures. Is it normal to release results if the quality control fails?
No, you can't use those results.
This is absolutely against any laboratory procedure.
But they said it happened often, and records indicated the lab repeatedly swapped samples or gave people wrong results, but had no process for correcting those results. Something else inspectors later confirmed. So does that mean people were getting negative results who were actually positive and there was no way to notify them that they had the wrong result?
Yeah.
Absolutely. And not only that, but it repeatedly happened.
It's tragic.
Most of the whistleblowers asked to remain anonymous, fearing retaliation. Then, along with their allegations, their fears were confirmed.
The company is now effectively suing one whistleblower.
PerkinElmer sued former manager Dr. Manaz Salam, the only whistleblower to reveal her identity.
They really want public to know that this lab should not continue operating like this.
The lawsuit didn't mention our reports, instead alleging Salam and 25 other unnamed defendants emailed proprietary information in violation of a confidentiality agreement and were using that information to PerkinElmer's competitive disadvantage.
The public deserves to know what's going on in their state lab, and everybody deserves to have correct results.
Whistleblowers insisted the documents we received were of no value to competitors and instead exposed a risk to public health.
Every patient sample is used with somebody's life.
The state wouldn't comment on PerkinElmer's lawsuit, which many saw as an intimidation tactic. Meanwhile, inspectors had already found the lab was likely to cause serious injury, harm, or death.
Thank you, Governor.
Yet regulators, some who took the medical oath to do no harm, didn't pause testing or even warn the public, and instead tried to discredit the whistleblowers who did.
Up next, state secrets, denials, and fixing a flawed test.
Inaccurate and incomplete responses from the state were among the many challenges we faced throughout this investigation, which unfolded amid the governor's divisive recall election, when many said they couldn't comment publicly due to fear of political or professional retaliation. Just before 11 p.m. on a Sunday night, 2 weeks after our first whistleblower report, Democratic lawmakers got a heads up from the governor's office about a planned Monday morning press release.
The state of California announcing today they found significant deficiencies at the state COVID testing lab.
Despite initial denials, health officials admitted they had known for months about, quote, significant deficiencies at the state's lab, but failed to warn the public as California's COVID cases and deaths peaked during this period of secrecy, between their December licensing inspection and the surprise inspection the night of our first whistleblower report.
They say these findings are separate from the state's ongoing investigation into those new whistleblower allegations.
The press release didn't reveal inspectors had already confirmed the whistleblower complaints. Instead, it echoed PerkinElmer's claims that the deficiencies had long since been resolved. That wasn't true. Inspection records would later confirm it would take 8 more months to correct deficiencies that posed immediate jeopardy to patient health and safety. In the meantime, the state would cite its ongoing investigation to deny requests for those records. They did provide one email related to an interview request with Health Secretary Galley, but redacted every single word, even the punctuation.
With any big endeavor like this done so quickly, we knew there were going to be growing pains.
Dr. Galley did give a February interview about our reports to Fox 11 in LA.
California launched an investigation into PerkinElmer after a series of stories on CBS 13 in Sacramento.
Fox 11 aired several excerpts from our stories.
By the end of January, when inconclusive results from the lab had quadrupled to more than 36,000.
But instead of revealing, inspectors had already confirmed the findings.
Dr. Galley says those numbers are misleading. He says out of 1.5 million tests, 60 had incorrect reports, and 250 samples were unable to be tested.
Except it's those numbers that are misleading. You see, our data was provided by his agency, which has multiple categories of samples that don't return clear results, including the inconclusive results, which have borderline virus levels, and invalid, lost, or canceled samples. Those are the ones that can't be processed due to test or human error.
Some of those very small number were not able to be processed.
At the time, the state's own data showed 1 out of 55 samples could not be processed. By the end of their first year, it was 1 out of 93. But there were likely more, because inspectors found the lab didn't properly report some lost, missing, or discarded samples. Even inspectors called the lab's records misleading. And remember all those inconclusive results we asked about when the lab first opened?
A higher number than expected of tests came back inconclusive.
It turned out many were actually invalid, meaning the test internal control failed. If you've ever done an at-home COVID test, you've seen the internal control. It's this blue line that turns pink if the test is working. If it's missing, the test is invalid. You can't trust the result. Well, records reveal that was happening a lot at the state lab. So they tried to fix their test, using patient samples for trial and error while reporting results.
They deviated from what was submitted to the FDA.
Does that mean that they're essentially experimenting with patient samples?
Yes, they are reporting patient samples and they are trying to troubleshoot it.
And that's illegal. By making changes, the lab voided the test's FDA emergency use authorization, which the $1.7 billion contract required. In fact, state inspectors cited the lab for it during their December inspection. Still, the state continued insisting its test was approved by the FDA, until the FDA confirmed it wasn't. That's when the California Department of Public Health claimed it had mistakenly said its test was FDA authorized, a mistake they repeated publicly for months.
Governor Newsom is involved, CDBH is involved. I assumed everything would be correct and legit.
After our story, the state amended PerkinElmer's contract to allow for what's called a lab-developed test. But inspectors confirmed whistleblower allegations that the lab never fully validated that test for accuracy.
Because a test is not validated, it's considered experimental.
And Doragato of the state's Lab Tech Association says a lab must tell patients that.
The patient should be aware and needs to agree.
Instead, the state hid it, insisting to us and claiming on patient results that their new test was validated. While according to inspection records, they struggled with the validation for at least 9 months, facing sanctions over it 10 days before the state renewed the lab's $1.7 billion contract.
Up next, a twist. How the trial of Theranos founder Elizabeth Holmes confirmed whistleblower allegations at the state's lab.
For nearly a year, regulators refused to reveal what state inspectors found at the lab, but in an interesting twist, we learned what federal inspectors found thanks to the high-profile Elizabeth Holmes Theranos trial. You see, the state's COVID lab director is the former lab director of Holmes' disgraced finger-prick blood testing company. And in October, court testimony revealed his license was at risk, not because of the famously flawed tests at Theranos, but because of what inspectors found at the state's COVID lab. The Silicon Valley trial of Theranos founder Elizabeth Holmes was a long way from Valencia, the home of California's PerkinElmer Public Health COVID testing lab. But the state's lab director, Dr. Adam Rosendorf, had been traveling back and forth.
Dr. Rosendorf, any comments on today's testimony?
He was a key whistleblower and witness for the federal government against Holmes, his former boss at Theranos. In an attempt to discredit him, Holmes' attorneys brought up the whistleblower investigation at his current lab. You see, in addition to the state's investigation, attorneys revealed federal inspectors also found serious deficiencies within the state COVID lab, which also appeared to confirm whistleblower allegations, ranging from inaccurate test results to quality control failures and inadequate validation reports, putting Rosendorf's license in jeopardy. As a result, the judge acknowledged a potential conflict of interest in the Holmes case. You see, the same federal inspector who Rosendorf was a whistleblower for in the Theranos investigation was now investigating Rosendorf's own work following the whistleblower complaints at the state lab, which many now refer to as the Theranos of public health.
We are now moving forward to disrupt the market.
From plans to disrupt the testing industry to denials, quality control issues, and flawed test validations, there are uncanny similarities. Like Theranos, CDPH tried to discredit whistleblowers and news reports, in the state's case, even after allegations were confirmed. Both Theranos and the state lab were found to pose immediate jeopardy to patient health and safety. They had the same lab director, the same federal inspector. The difference? Regulators revoked Theranos' license, but not the state lab's. And while Theranos is accused of defrauding millionaire investors, it's taxpayers who are funding the state's lab.
That's just irresponsible with taxpayers' money. So really appreciate your efforts bringing this forward.
State Senator Scott Wilk was one of many who was frustrated when CDPH renewed the $1.7 billion contract before the state's investigation was even complete. We now know the lab was still facing sanctions at the time, nearly a year after inspectors first identified the threat of serious injury, harm, or death.
We will continue to press until we get the answer that the public deserves.
But when the state finally released its public report heading into Thanksgiving, they made no mention of the fact that inspectors confirmed the whistleblower allegations. Instead, they touted the lab as a model for other states and the federal government, claiming the lab's deficiencies are routinely found in lab inspections and had no impact on the integrity of the test.
Well, that would be impossible. You just can't make a statement like that. It makes no sense.
This was not just oops, we made a minor mistake that didn't harm any patients.
Tim Hamill is the former chair of the state's Clinical Lab Technology Advisory Committee. Dora Gatto is a current voting member.
Are these deficiencies that are routinely found?
Never to that magnitude.
I've never inspected a lab that had this many problems. That's like Lab 101.
They note the actual inspection records, buried in a link at the bottom of the state's 10-page summary, confirm the whistleblower complaints and contradict the state's summary.
Any other laboratory would have been shut down.
And until the lab is ready to turn out a consistently quality test, they shouldn't have started.
They're among many in the laboratory community shocked that the state's COVID lab was allowed to continue processing patient samples while failing to correct deficiencies for nearly a year without revealing the risk to patients.
That's not how laboratories are supposed to operate in the United States.
Inspectors appeared to agree, chastising the lab director for downplaying the risk, noting there is no acceptable error rate for false negative results for a highly transmissible viral infection.
And do you agree with their assessment?
When we asked the inspectors at a public meeting about the discrepancy between the state's public summary and the findings in their actual inspection reports, the chief said they couldn't comment on the state's summary.
I will stand behind my team's report.
While some media outlets simply reported the state's misleading summary, several who actually reviewed the inspection records revealed the truth.
Even if it politically looks bad, it looks worse when it comes out in the press.
As for those billion-dollar promises,
150,000 tests a day.
The lab is still far below that goal, and in its first year, roughly 1 out of every 49 samples did not return a clear result.
This lab also promises to get results back within 48 hours, but a stated goal within 24 hours.
Another goal they haven't met.
Best price guarantees.
Commercial companies now charge a fraction of Perkins' contracted rate with faster results and have the capacity to process the samples currently being sent to the state lab. Good job.
There's an old saw that says, you continue to do what you've done, you'll get what you've got.
Several lawmakers say they're now considering legislative options to ensure this never happens again.
As much as people complain about the media has a purpose, and one of them is to be a watchdog on the government when they won't be a watchdog on themselves.
But the real credit goes to the whistleblowers who stressed wrong results are more dangerous than no test at all.
I think the whistleblowers did a great service to the people of California.
Without them, the risk to public health could have been far greater, and we may have never known.
To the whistleblowers, thank you. I've got to believe or hope that the laboratory is a better laboratory now because of what the whistleblowers did.
The federal investigation is ongoing, and the state is now moving toward rapid testing for students. But whistleblowers are now calling for the state auditor to investigate the true impact of the false negative results, along with the preferential treatment of this lab, potential conflicts of interest, and why regulators hid the risk from patients for so long.
Every patient sample is used with somebody's life.
The public deserves to know what's going on in their state lab, and everybody deserves to have correct results.